Okay, here we go.
Tonight we'll be covering from verse 12 through verse 21. As we begin this section, it is readily admitted by all that this is one of the most difficult sections in the book of Romans. That there's some things in here that are hard to be understood and lots of argumentation back and forth. Yet on the other hand, I think that we will see it is one of the simplest things to be understood. One of the complications is that we start out with a preconceived idea. When we start out with a preconceived idea, and that idea is wrong, then we start building everything on it, and then we get mixed up in our study. As we always do if we start out on a wrong presumption. Now, as we began this section right here, let us go back and lay the groundwork in this way. As you start in chapter 1 and verse 16 and 17, the very theme of the book. Let's go back now and look at that very theme, chapters 1, 16, and 17. Now, the first thing he says is that I am not ashamed of what? Of the gospel of Christ. For therein is revealed, and then we have the theme of the book. What is the theme of the book? Salvation by faith. In that gospel, we're told how people can be saved by faith. All right, now that is the first thing. All right, then we go ahead over here, and before you can really get anybody's interest when you're going to be talking about salvation, you need to show them that they have a need for salvation, and that is that they're lost. So then, in chapter 1, who does he show as lost? What group of people?
Jews.
Who's the first group? All right, the Gentiles, the first group. And then, what's the next? Then the Jews are lost. All right, now that takes us down then to chapter 3 and in verse 20. Starting in chapter 3 and in verse 21 then, the next thing that he does is give us the doctrine then of salvation by faith. And he begins to talk about that. Now that's the theme that he said that he was going to talk about. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for in the gospel is revealed how man is saved by faith. Then he shows how over here you people are lost. And now then, he said, he shows how to save by faith. Then in the remaining part, then, I'll start again in chapter 4, and through the remaining part, all of chapter 4, he gives an example then of salvation by faith. And who's the example? Abraham is the example. Then we move into chapter 5, and in chapter 5, in 1 through 11, there he shows the results of salvation by faith. How does that start out? What are the results of salvation by faith? Therefore, being saved by faith, we have what? Peace with God. Then he goes ahead to develop that, how we have peace with God. For we can even rejoice in our tribulations, because tribulations works what? Perseverance, and then perseverance shows you what? It proves that you're steadfast, and then that shows you what? Then you have hope, and then if you have hope, what do you have? Every reason to believe you're going to be saved, don't you? In other words, what is the definition of hope? It is desire plus expectation, and so we have every reason then that we're going to be saved. So then, down here we have the results. Now then, we come down here to this section right here, chapter 5, 12 through 21. And sometimes we say it's hard to see how it fits in. Because in here, what he's going to do is take Adam versus Christ. And he's going to be comparing these two. And showing what Adam did, how that in Adam, all men sinned, and in Christ over here, all men can be made alive or can be saved. And so then we're going to be talking about Adam and Christ down here. So you say, now how does that fit in the whole theme of the book? Because in chapter 6, then he's going to go ahead and pick up the theme here, really salvation of faith. So how does this fit in? I think that what we're going to see that is fitting in is this. And that is that this writing here is a demonstration of this right over here. In other words, Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why? It is the power of God. See? There is the big thing. Now, it is the power. So over here, this right in here now is the power of God unto salvation. Right? What this is going to do over here is give us an example or a demonstration of how much power there is in the gospel. See? So over here now, over there is a statement of the power. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is God's power. And then he gets down here, and now then he's going to demonstrate how much power that there really is. It's just like over here, he gave the doctrine here in chapter 3 of salvation by faith, and then in chapter 4, he gives us a demonstration or an example of salvation by faith. So, I think as we look at it like this section right here is a demonstration of that power. Just exactly how powerful is it? Well, you say, back over here, it's powerful enough to save. Yes, but how powerful is that? How much power do you have to save? Now, as we're just talking about that, let me ask you this question. How much power did Adam's sin have?
Life. You gotta make that a garden.
All right, it got him expelled out of the garden. What else? Okay. It introduced death into the world. It introduced sin into the world. It changed every human being's life. Every individual has had to die since Adam. It has an influence on every individual's life. His sin just absolutely turned the world upside down, if you want to put it that way, because of what sin has done to mankind. So the power in Adam's sin is just absolutely unimaginable. But now we're going to see tonight where the power in Christ is even more powerful than that. All right, now as we start out, let's go down to chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Now right there is generally where we get stopped. And we spend about 3 hours right there. Because what this sounds like, if that's all that you have, if that's the only statement that you have in the Bible, what that sounds like is that when Adam sinned, we all sinned, right? And when Adam sinned, we all died because we all sinned when Adam sinned. That's what that sounds like. Now, that's what that could mean, if that's the only statement that we have in the Bible. And that's where the doctrine of inherited sin really gets its power. The people believe in inherited sin. They teach that when Adam sinned, he then, when he had a child, he passed that sin on. And every individual who's ever born inherits Adam's sin. And so, when you inherit sin, then every child is born totally depraved, because every child is born in sin, and their soul is just as black as coal, and they teach that there is nothing good about them. They can not do anything except evil, because you inherit Adam's sin. Now, just to start with, as you look at it on a practical basis, that if Adam had gone out and started to pick off that piece of fruit, whatever it was, let's suppose that he had taken an axe out there, and he going to chop off the limb so he could get it, and he chopped off his hand. Now, would Adam have any problems? He wouldn't, wouldn't he? Would he have passed that trait on to his generations after him? In other words, if a guy gets his hand cut off, does his children, are they born with their hands cut off? No, you don't pass on something that you do, you see, to your offspring. So inherent sin doesn't sound reasonable to start with in here, but here's where we get bogged down in this. Now, first of all, let's stop and let's look at it right here for just a moment in this. Now, we need to understand the why this is in there. Why are we talking about this, first of all? Now, Whiteside has a good statement right here. In this section right here, where you're comparing one act of Adam to the one act of Christ, he said he is not trying to show the origin of sin. Christianity concerned with the origin of sin so much as with the fact of sin. The gospel did not bring sin into the world, but it was brought into the world as the panacea for sin and all its illnesses. Now remember, that one may be on your test again. That's the one that got so many. Remember the last time? And that is, did the gospel cause sin? In other words, when the gospel was brought in, then people didn't obey the gospel. Is that what causes sin? No, you see, the gospel is the cure for sin. The gospel is the cure. That's what he's talking about in here, that Paul is going to be talking about the cure of it. He's not going to be talking about the origin of it. Now, he is showing the death resulted from sin, and the one act of Christ is the cure for sin. Now, that's what he's going to show. That death, whatever that is, resulted from Adam's one act of sin, and Christ's one act of dying is the cure for it. He is showing that whatever sin did when introduced by Adam, that Christ undid, and much more. I don't think there's undid. Whatever knots Adam tied, Christ untied. See, that is what this section is going to show. And that really is what it is all about in here. Now, as we start looking at this, we're going to see that we have to wrestle with the problem. Is this talking about physical death, or is it talking about spiritual death? All right, first of all, when Adam sinned, did physical death come into the world? Was it introduced? Well, he didn't die right at that time when he began dying. I mean, as a result of that sin, a death entered. There was such a thing as death right there. 800 years later, he died. See? Yeah.
My understanding is that what happened is that it was the access to the tree of life that kept it from dying. I believe that man is mortal all the time. And so when you access to the tree that you stay alive, I don't think it's physical death that entered into the world when sin.
Well, I think it's spiritual death we're talking about here, but what I'm saying is physical death entered in. They were expelled from the garden. You're right, they were expelled from the tree of life, the source of all life. So now then, since you don't have a source of life, where are you going? There's only one place, death. See? So, yes, Adam's sin is the cause of physical death. But the context all the way through favors spiritual death. Now let me ask you this. How much physical death have we been talking about so far? Salvation by faith. How much physical salvation or anything? None. See? We're not going to talk about it again. We're talking about what the gospel does for us. All right, now we're talking about our spiritual death. Now another thing is, whatever came as a result of Adam's act was cured by the act of Christ. That's what he's going to say in here. That whatever Adam did to us is that was physical death. Then when Christ died on the cross, then he took it away. Well, we know when Christ died on the cross that we still have death. All men, even infants, die physical death. Christ never removed that death. Hebrews 9:27 is what man was to die. And down here, we're talking about by the grace of God and the death of Christ, man does not have to die the spiritual death when he's saved by faith. That's what we're talking about. Now, what I'm going to do in here is we're not going to stop and argue about whether it is physical or spiritual. We'll see it as it develops in just a little while. Now, all I'm saying is in verse 12, if that's all we have, there's not a man living who can tell you whether it's physical or spiritual, because it just says death, and we have those two kinds. But the context and everything about it, and these things up here show whatever Christ did, whatever ever did Christ undid, shows it has to be spiritual. Now, we're going to look at it from the spiritual death, and then when we get through, I think that you'll see the point that we're talking about spiritual death all down through here. Now, another point I want us to see is that verses 13 and through 17 are parenthetical. For us to get the point and analyze this the way that it needs to be in here, we have to understand that there is a parenthesis in there. Now, what do you mean by parenthetical? What can you do to a statement that is parenthetical?
Take it out.
You can just lift it out, set it over to the side, and read it, and you have a complete thought. Well, why have a parenthetical thought or parenthesis put in there then? What are they for? to explain. They're just to explain what you're talking about right up here. So what we have then is this. Therefore, as through one man, Adam, sin entered into the world, and death, spiritual death through sin. And so death passed unto all men, for that all sinned. Now, we're going to talk about that. That's what we're going to be talking about, is how everybody sins. See, that's the point now, down through verse 17. Then we'll get back on the subject again. So if you wanted to skip it, you just skip down then to verse 18. It says, so then, and then it goes ahead and makes the point that is in there. All right, now, first of all, I want us to note in verse 12, who does it say sin in verse 12? All men sin. That's what it said, doesn't it? See? That all men sin. Now, as through one man, sin entered into the world. That's how it got here. Sin entered in through one man, but after sin entered in, then what did all men do then? Then is when all men sinned. Let me get down here to get a chart right down here. Again, I want to move the thing around here. Let's take this. Let us suppose that we were going to accuse Adam of introducing measles into the world. And I suppose he did. That through one man. Now, somebody introduced measles into the world. So suppose we said, all people, through one man, all people get measles. Every individual living, whoever you are, gets measles through one man. What do we mean by that? What would we mean?
The only way you get measles is through that.
Yeah, it's through that source that's in there. Suppose that somebody goes to Hong Kong, and they're over there, and there's a new strain of flu that's over there. We don't have it over here. And they get the flu. They bring it over here, and everybody in the United States gets the flu, Hong Kong flu. Now, through one man, everybody got the flu. What did we mean by that? Well, he introduced the flu bug. See, he introduced the germ here, and then we are susceptible to it. How many rocks get the flu? How many trees get the flu? Why do they get the flu? They're not susceptible to it. All right, Adam introduced sin into the world. And then as a result of him introducing sin into the world, just like somebody bringing Hong Kong flu or the measles over here, then all man sinned because all men are subject to sin, and we've all followed along that line, and we've all sinned. So what this says then is that we've all sinned. Now, because all sinned. Now then, in verse 13, it's the next point here, goes ahead and he says, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. Right now, for until the law, sin was in the world. As we look at this, there are two schools of thought on this. And first of all, when you look in the Greek, the article the is not in there. It says, for until law, sin was in the world. So there's no article there. Now, a lot of people make a big play in the book of Romans, a great big play on that article. That if you don't have the article in there, then it's talking about law in general. If you do have the article in there, then it's talking about the law of Moses. Now, I think that we're making a little bit too much of a play on that as you read some of the commentaries. If it has the article in, then I think definitely it's talking about the law of Moses. But if it doesn't have the article in, then it can either be talking about the law or it can be talking about law in general. See, it really wouldn't make any difference. If I told you I want to talk tonight about the church, do you have any idea what I'm going to be talking about? The one church, right? If I tell you, I'd like to meet Sunday, I'd like to have a function of, well, I was going to say, I put the church in there. I'd like to have a church function. Do you have to say I'd like to have the church function? We would understand what we mean by a church. church. See if you put it in that particular context. Now, I think this is talking about the law of Moses. What I think that we've got over here is that over here is Adam. No, that's too far back. This is where God was back there. God created, and over here then we have Adam. Now then we come down here, and we have the law of Moses. All right, now, what took place between Adam and the law of Moses? Now, here we have Adam, so we know that Adam sinned. See, Adam sinned. And then over here, when God took Moses up there, then God gave him a law, and we know that people sinned after that. Now then, what about right here, at this period of time? All right, now what it's saying is, right here, for until the law, sin was in the world. But sin is not imputed where there is no law. All right, what this says is, right in here, that sin was here. You know what it says? Sin was in the world. Then it says, and sin is not imputed where there is no law. So what do you know we got here? We know that we have a law. You see why we know we have some kind of law in here? Because you can't have sin unless you have a law, and we do have sin, therefore we have law. Now, we put a question mark up here, what kind of law? We know what Adam did, and we know about the law of Moses over here. But over here, what he says is, men were sinning in here, and you can't sin unless there is law. Now, that really is what this is saying right here. It says, well, I don't guess I read all of it right in here. In 14, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense or sin of Adam, who is a type of him who is to come. Now, what we've got in here is this. It tells us that death passed unto all men for all sin. Now, Adam introduced sin, but all men then have sin on their own. Romans 3:23. That's what that's talking about. For until the law, sin was in the world. Now, this is talking about moral law. It's talking about the breaking of moral law. Now, you say, why not call it God's law? Well, moral law is God's law, isn't it? In other words, all law emanates from God. But the reason I'm not calling it God's law is because God has several kinds of laws that we'll see in just a minute. Now, what do we mean by moral law when we talk about moral law? What's the difference between moral law, civil law, religious law? A moral law is the action between man and man, how you treat your fellow man. Now, these were in there during that period of time. Now, he says, the sin is not imputed where there is no law. What that means is people are saved to the extent of the law. That's all that statement is meaning. That if there is no law, there is no sin. How much can you sin? How much is it? How much sins can I commit? To the extent of the law. That's it. And if there is no law against something, then I can't sin in that particular thing. How can I sin in going to the moon? Taking a trip from here to the moon. Is that sin?
Unless the law against it.
And not unless there's law against it. There is no law against it, so I can go to the moon all I want to. There is no sin against going to the moon. See, that's all that is saying. But if God says, thou shalt not go to the moon, then there's law, then I can sin. That's all that's talking about. Sin is not imputed where there is no law. It means that you must live up to that extent of the law. Yeah.
One question. Where it says sin is not imputed, it seems to me it's not saying that sin is not sin, but it's not imputed. If God hasn't told us that it's sin, well, I think about it like Adam and Eve were running around with no clothes on in the Garden of Eden, in public fashion, and as soon as they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it became known to them that was not right, so they immediately covered themselves. But was it the fact that did it become sin for them to run around publicly naked, or was it just not imputed until they knew about it?
Well, I think we're talking about semantics. in that. That I don't have that you would make any distinction. In other words, I'm not guilty of sin until it is imputed to me, until it's written down against me. It's not written down against me unless there's a law that is there. And so if in any way you talk about sin, it have to be in a metaphysical sense of only God knowing that a person shouldn't do this like that. But no, I think that what it's talking about is as far as human beings are concerned, you sin only up to the law that you are under. That's all that statement right there is saying. Now in verse 14, what he is telling them is this. He says, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses. Now, why did death reign? Why do you die? Because you sinned. All right, death reigned. Death was in control from Adam over to Moses. Men did sin at this period of time, right in here. Then is what it's saying. Now he did read, but even over those who had not sinned. If I stop there, have I lied? Yes. In other words, if I stopped right there and preaching that, that would be just a contradiction of the Bible, just reversing. Now, it doesn't say even over those who had not sinned. It says over those who had sinned. Isn't that what your Bible says? Read it there. No, it says over those who had sinned.
Mine says even those who have not sinned.
Okay, I'm glad Troy argued with me. No, Troy said over those who had not sinned, who had sinned. Now, what do I mean by this? Obviously, I'm making a play on words. What? Okay, look at the next three words there, Troy. Here's what I'm talking about. Over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam. In other words, they had not sinned like Adam sinned. They had sinned, but it was not like Adam sinned. See, that's the point I made. Now, what was Adam's sin? Adam had a direct, thou shalt not be positive, definite law from God. See, that's what he had. It just God told him, thou shalt not. Now, when Adam committed that sin, he was committing a sin that we would call just a positive, direct violation of God's command. However you want to call it. I don't know a word to call it that way. But what was the moral implication of eating of that fruit? What was the moral implication involved in it? Yeah, but I mean in relationship to your fellow man. What we call morality.
Well, you got morals from that because the knowledge of what's right and wrong came into the world because of it.
Well, the knowledge of it came in, but what was immoral about eating that? What is immoral about not being baptized?
Because it's the command of God.
That's not immoral. How does it affect me? What does it do when I teach a man? He says, I don't want to be baptized. Morality is your relationship to your fellow man. What?
It's not a question of morality.
It's not a question of morality, whether you're baptized or not. A man who's baptized is no more moral than a man who's not baptized. Now, if a man is not baptized, he's in direct violation of God's law. See? But it's not a moral law, is what I'm saying. Now, suppose a guy walks up and slaps me in the face. Now, God said don't do that too. See? But now, what kind of law has he violated there? See, he violated a direct command and a moral law. Now, when you get into treating your fellow man as you would have them to treat you, now then you're into the moral laws. See, that's what I'm trying to make the distinction. That over here, there was nothing immoral about eating that, regardless of what came to pass. If it was immoral to eat of it, then I guess having the knowledge of good and evil would be immoral. I mean, if you went ahead and put the end result down there. And we'd all be living in immorality every day of our life. This thing is not immoral, see, in that sense. Now, whatever these people did, it was not like Adam. That's the whole point that he's making. These people did not have a direct law that they violated. God gave up the Gentiles, took Abraham, and Abraham lived in this period of time, and the Gentiles all sinned because, well, what is it called back in Romans 2? Violation of the conscience, see? And now, down to Moses, it did this. Now, in Moses, now then we have a written law, a religious law, a moral law, and a civil law. Yeah.
Where did the moral laws come from?
They all originate from God.
Would they be direct laws? That's what I'm thinking. How did they get them? How did that be formed?
Every law that we've got comes from God. But what I'm talking about in a moral law is that if, what would it be? If I treat you in a way in which I shouldn't treat you, but there's no statement that says don't do this. I see you have a flat tire and I just drive on by. You see, if Randy's in trouble, I don't care, let him walk home. I have not treated you the way that a human being should be treated.
You go to God's word now and show you.
Oh, you can go to God's word. It said you treat Randy like you want to be treated. But I'm asking you, where does it say I can't drive by and let you walk in the rain?
God built it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying, God built it.
Oh, every law comes from God. There is no law that doesn't come from God. But I'm just saying that you can break them down into different spheres, see, in different ways. Moral laws have always been here. They started right here. They were right on through. We don't have one single moral law that they didn't have in the Old Testament. We don't have a single moral law that they didn't have right there. Moral laws go right on through. Religious laws do not. What they had to do religiously under the law of Moses, they didn't have to do over here. What they did over there, we don't have to do over here in Christ. See, that's all I'm getting. Civil laws, some of them treat morality, don't they? But they treat it from a civil viewpoint, is what I'm getting. Yeah.
I think what Randy, what I think answers Randy's question is, when Adam ate the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he immediately knew he was naked, clothed himself. It wasn't something like God just spoke it out, but the knowledge of good and evil became part of mankind. Either was it passed down to Adam's teaching and then from there to there, or was it just a part of human nature now to know right and wrong about these kind of things? That's where it all came in.
Yeah, there have been always argued about the origin of it. We know that it came from God, that's all we know. That it does come from God. But you see what I'm talking about, the different kind of laws? Look, here's the reason I bring this up. Whatever they did was not like Adam. Adam sinned a different kind of sin. See? That's all that I'm getting at. And if I go out and shoot somebody tonight, that is a different kind of sin than if somebody says, I'm not going to be baptized. There are no moral implications in baptism. In fact, there's only one reason why you should be baptized. I mean, you can't even think of it, one and a half. What's the only reason? That's all. Just God said it. Now, God said don't murder. I know that, so I shouldn't murder. But why? I know why I shouldn't murder. There are lots of other implications in that. I'm killing somebody made in the image of God. I'm doing something to somebody that I would not want him to do to me. I'm violating moral principles now. See? And baptism is violating the direct law of God.
First of all, we talked about the idea of full depravity and and other doctrines. And so we're saying that verse 14 is sometimes misunderstood to support that as well. Or am I? That's why we're getting into the segregation again of the type of sin we're talking about here between moral and say direct command from God. Is it true that some people are understanding this to mean that just praying from Adam to Moses, even
sin. See? And so, how did we get it? It was passed down. See, the only point I'm making is we sinned, and what it says is, we sinned, but it was not after that. We did it right there, and then let's go ahead and look at something else right in here now. It said in 14, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned, in the likeness of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. Now we're bringing Christ in. Okay? Now we're going to compare Christ to Adam. All right, first of all, before we go any farther, let's stop right here and ask ourselves why we have Adam introduced anyway. So far, Adam has been introduced to show us what he did. Adam, one man, by one act, affected how many people? The entire world. That's power in that one act, isn't it? See? Now, we're going to use that to show the power that Jesus Christ has. In verse 15, but the free gift but the free gift is not like the transgression. For if the transgression of the one, many died, much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abound unto many. Right here now, he says that as we compare Adam and Christ, we're going to compare them and we're going to see they're not alike. Now this is kind of where it throws us a little bit, because we Western people, we think more in the positive, and they were stating in the negative in here, but he says, we're going to compare it. Now it's not alike. Now here's what is not alike. That is by the trespass of one man brought death. Adam's sin introduced sin in the world. Every man says that has sinned, and in death there is condemnation of every man by the one act of one man. Now that is not like this over here. Over here, by the one act, the free gift by the grace of God abounded from one man. Now over here it just happened, but over here now we're going to add the word abound. This is going to be so much greater than this. In each case we have one man doing one thing. One man doing one thing. This over here is so powerful we can't imagine it, because it affected every person that's ever lived. But this over here is so much more powerful. How was it, chapter 1, verse 15, we started out? I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is. See? Now, as we continue on then, he says in verse 16, and the gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. For on the one hand, the judgment arose from one transgression, resulting in condemnation, but on the other hand, the free gift arose from the many transgressions, resulting in justification. All right? And here then, we have this. We have one man committing one act by the transgression of the one, death reigned. That's spelled right, that's what it's being said. Death reigned. Now, over here I'm trying to show much more. That's the purpose of this section. That's the only purpose of this section. Now, none of us can comprehend the power of that one sin of Adam, how it affected every human being that's ever lived. But over here, much more. That's the point. Shall they that receive the abundance of grace. That's the point in here. And the gift of righteousness shall reign in life through one. Over here, the death reign. Over here, we're going to reign in righteousness over here. And boy, I sure didn't tell you from space above this building. Over there in the reign there, so it's much more abundance of grace and reigning. In other words, whatever Adam did, Christ undid. And he just undid it much, much, much more in abundance. That's the whole purpose of this section that is in here. Now, in verse 17, for if by the transgression of the one, death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. So then, as through one transgression, there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness, there resulted justification of life to all men. Now, right here is where that parenthesis begins, right here in verse 18. What I'm going to do now is, I'm going to go back and read verse 12. No comment, and jump immediately to verse 18. And you'll see then how it fits. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all sinned. So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. You see how it just carries, the thought just carries right on through. That's the whole point that he's getting there. Now then, in verse 19, then he goes ahead and he says, for as through one man's disobedience the many were made sinners. For as through one man's disobedience the many were made sinners. Now, what that is to the people, and you have to understand 99% of the religious world believes this, that you inherit sin. Now, the way they read this then is, as through one man's disobedience, Adam's disobedience, the many were made sinners, bingo, at that time. When Adam sinned, then every person has been made a sinner when Adam sinned. Now, look at what it says. Even so, through the obedience of one, the many will be made righteous. Now, let's look at what this says. Through one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. Through one man's obedience, here, the many shall be made righteous. Now, whatever Adam did, Christ undid. If inherited sin is true, that's not. But if it is true, and if when Adam sinned, he passed that sin on to all men, and every little baby was born in sin, then when Christ died, what did it do to inherited sin when every little baby was born? It's gone, and they're made totally righteous. See? So whatever Adam did, Christ undid. And then he did much more. You see than that. Now you might say, well, how did he do much more than just doing this? Well, when Christ died, he not only took away what Adam did, that is Adam's sin, if Adam were forgiven, Adam's sin, he not only took that away, but how many other sins did he take away? Millions and billions and billions of sins, all the sins of all the people who have sinned through the ages because Adam introduced sin into the world. So through that one act, he did all of that. Now, right here, I want to hit that point right there and show us on this again, this inherited sin type thing, because it goes in people's minds and so forth through there. Now, look right here at this. If all men were made sinners automatically without their actions through Adam, but when Adam sinned, then all men inherited that sin. We all became sinners. Then all men were made righteous automatically without their actions through Christ. Isn't that what that teaches? See? So, I'm just trying to pound it home to show really the point that we've got here. All right? Now in verse 1. And the law came in that the transgression or sin might increase or abound, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. Now, where the law came in besides, that sin might increase. Let me ask you a question. Did God give the law to the Jews in order to get them to sin? Was that His purpose? So that we'd have more sin? That wasn't His purpose, was it? Now, so we laid that groundwork in a long study back there. We studied Galatians 3. Why did God give the law? Okay, because men had sinned. Because of sin, to try to hold them under control. They were sinning so much that He gave them more law to try to hold them under control. Now, when He gave more law, what happened? Now, from God's point of view, what did God want when He gave more law? never did anything wrong, but yours did. So now, you have a kid, and he did something wrong. You call him in and you say, now, sit down. I'm going to lay the law down to you, buddy. From here on, you're to be home by 9 o'clock. You're not to drive the car any farther than McDonald's. You're to do 2 hours of homework, and you're to be in bed at 10 o'clock and sleep at 10:30. Now, you've added that. Why? I walk in on you and I hear you laying down that law. Why do I know you're laying down that law? Because you got to get a transgression. Now, what else do I know? He's been doing all these bad things. Now, what else do I know is going to happen in the future? Hey, he's got a lot more laws to break now. That's right. See? Now, that's not the reason you're giving the laws. You're giving the laws to hold it under control. But what will a rebellious child do? That just break more laws. You see? That's your gift. All right, now that's what this is talking about right here. As we look at it now, he said, now here's what the facts of the case are. Back here, from Adam down to Moses, we have the moral law and they sinned. Then God, through Moses, gave the law of Moses. Religious laws, moral laws, civil laws. Now sin abounded because they had more law, therefore they sinned more. Because of their rebellion. But now, whatever they did in here, when Christ came, grace abounded more exceedingly than all the sins that had ever been committed. Much more. And reigned through righteousness unto eternal life. So, whatever men did when they were committing all of those sins, that grace came and it abounded all the more. So verse 21, that as sin reigned in death. Now, up to the time when Jesus died and paid for the sins of mankind, men died spiritually. Now, I realized they were offering the blood of bulls and goats, and I realized God said, I forgive you, and I realized Abraham went to heaven. I know all of that. And I know when I ask you the question, it's a loaded question. I can ask you, were their sins forgiven? Was Abraham's sins forgiven when he went to heaven? That's kind of, it's one of those loaded questions. And you say, well, it couldn't have been unless he couldn't have gone to heaven unless they were forgiven, and that's right. But they were forgiven only on what basis? In view of the future sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And so I've often thought, at that time when Peter started to fight, to keep Jesus from going to the cross, and Jesus said I could call for 12 legions of angels, and he'd send them down right now, and certainly they could equip the Roman army. If Jesus had done that, prayed to God to call for the angels to come down, whip the Roman army, and then he ascended back up the right hand of God, and he hadn't have died.
We have to stop the class at this time. So our class time has expired, so we'll go ahead and take a break, and then we'll start our worship services at 11 o'clock.
Hey, Skip. No, I'll do it now. I was gonna talk to this Jeff, but I'll have you do that, but I'll do it. So you got, you're going after the topic.
Brought that quilt top for you. I